Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Kyle Livy. I am professor of history at Ohlone College and co-director of the Lytton Center for History and the Public Good. And it's my honor and privilege to welcome all of you to our event today, New Directions in Asian American History. Before I begin, I want to tell you a little bit about the Lytton Center. The Lytton Center considers ways that the study of the past can shape the present and the future. Our mission is to inspire the Ohlone College community to work for the public good through programming focused on access, equity, inclusion, justice, and service. The Lytton Center explores challenges facing our community and the world, past, present, and future, and fosters big ideas that will inspire and transform Ohlone and the larger community for the better. Through training, programming, and capacity building, the Lytton Center empowers students to advocate for a just and equitable world. Before I pass things off to my fellow co-director, Dr. Heather McCarty, who will introduce our first panelist, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. We want you to be engaged in our talks today, so please use the Q&A feature located in Zoom if you're watching us by Zoom. If you have questions or comments that our panelists will address when we're done with both talks. Or you can email us your questions at lyttoncenter, all one word, at ohlone.edu. And I will post that information regularly in our Zoom webinar chat. I'm going to pass things over now to Dr. Heather McCarty, one of the other co-directors for the Lytton Center, who's going to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Kyle. Dr. Phuong Nguyen, if you want to turn your camera on, great, thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Phuong Nguyen. He is an associate professor of U.S. History in the Department of Humanities and Communication at CSU Monterey Bay. Dr. Nguyen has devoted his professional career to studying race and ethnicity in multiple contexts. This is reflected in the courses that he teaches, such as Asian American History, Multicultural History, California at the Crossroads, Race and Love in Asian America, the Sociology of Sport, and Asian American Race Rebels. Dr. Nguyen's first book, Becoming Refugee American, The Politics of Rescue in Little Saigon, is a social and cultural history of the largest overseas Vietnamese community and their uneasy relationship to the refugee identity, which facilitated their entry into the country on moral rather than legal grounds, while also imposing the expectation of eternal gratitude that limits their full participation in the body politic. When he's not working, Dr. Nguyen enjoys road trips and picnics with his wife and 2 daughters. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Dr. McCarty, Dr. Livy, the Lytton Center, and all of Ohlone College. So it's a pleasure to be here and to be a part of this. Is it okay if I share my screen now?
Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and get this presentation started here. So I first want to foreground this presentation by talking about my own background as a first generation. Is a big deal since we are at a community college. Community college has been an important part of my family's history. When we first came to the United States in the late 70s, we were settled in upstate New York, and unfortunately we couldn't make it there too long. Besides the weather, the state of New York wouldn't let my father go to school and work at the same time, but he learned that in California you could, and because of how affordable community colleges were and just public education in general at that time, he was able to do such a thing and to get his associate's degree to learn skills he otherwise would not have been able to learn, and also to improve his English as well. My younger brother went to community college before transferring to San Jose State, and I've taken community college classes myself. So it's a pleasure and honor to be on a campus where exciting things are happening. And as a professor at a CSU, at least a third of our students are transfers. So community college is very important to me. And like I said, you guys are doing wonderful things, and you guys have some wonderful people around you. And thank you everybody for showing up today. So let's start with the content of the presentation. I think one of the questions we're most often asked is how we came up with our research topic. And a common answer that people say is that I didn't find my research topic found me. And although I probably didn't ever say that myself, that's probably what in fact did happen to me. Most of my youth and my adult life, I really didn't have an interest in studying Vietnamese Americans. Maybe the topic was too close to me, or maybe the politics of the community, which tend to be very conservative, very Republican, especially in the 80s and 1990s, was something that really I didn't agree too much with, and I probably didn't feel comfortable getting too close to. And in 1999, there was a seminal event in Vietnamese American history that really touched off, feelings that I had about the community. In 1999, early 1999, a video store owner in Orange County, after returning from Vietnam, decided to post a photograph of communist hero Ho Chi Minh in his video store. And for the next 45 days, that sparked the largest protest in Vietnamese American history. And as you can see here from photographs that were taken at that time, members of the community and people from all over Southern California migrated to this shopping center. And you can see the video store, the high-tech video store in the background. And essentially shut the store down, shut the whole shopping center down. And it was portrayed in the mainstream media as Vietnamese Americans being very intolerant of First Amendment rights. And it was also portrayed as Vietnamese Americans not being able to really let go of the past, that they were still obsessed with the past, that over 20 years after the fact, they were still fighting the Vietnam War, that they were still unable to live in the present. And so I was very turned off of, and discouraged from doing research on the community. And it wasn't until an advisor of mine, Lon Kurashige, historian at the University of Southern California, encouraged me to do it anyway. He says, "You're an historian, Phuong, at least you want to be." And there hasn't been a social history of Little Saigon that's been written. And I think you would be the perfect person to do it. And this was already after 3 years of graduate school. So I guess my case goes to show that you don't have to have your topic picked right away. And my initial research question was, why are Vietnamese Americans still so obsessed about the past? Why can't they let go of something that seemingly the rest of the American population and seemingly the rest, the country of Vietnam has been able to let go, that bygones are bygones and people are able to move on and look forward instead of looking backwards. And those journeys first took me to the Southeast Asian Archive at the University of California, Irvine, where I was able to access a plethora of primary documents, past and present, able to read exciting new scholarship. You can see here dissertations by the next generation of scholars. They're already tenured professors now in academia, but this was exciting for me to be exposed to what the conversations and theories and existing research on Vietnamese Americans were. And as you can see, there wasn't that much yet. But what really excited me about doing this with the Southeast Asian Archive, who were taking classes at UC Irvine and having to do research for papers, and asking the librarian, the archivist, if they had any books on Little Saigon. And the answer invariably was, no, we don't have any yet. We have this article, that article, but no books yet. So I figured, you know what, that was my calling. I knew that I had to be at least one of the people to do this. So that's when I got started. The hard part was figuring out, who I needed to talk to. I'm not from Orange County. I'm not from San Jose. I didn't grow up in a big Vietnamese community. So I had to find a way to find informants for my study. And I just happened to luck out because certain people happened to publish their photo or their phone numbers in the phone book. And I decided to cold call people, and they agreed to talk to me. And, one of the first people me is this gentleman here. His name is Phuong Nguyen. He was a social worker at the time at Catholic Charities in Los Angeles. But besides being a social worker, he was also one of the pillars of the Vietnamese community and also the music industry as well. And he wrote the first ever Vietnamese American song, which I'm going to talk about a little later in this talk. From him, I was able to meet other people like Viet Dung, who is also a pioneer in the Vietnamese American music industry. He's also wrote some of the first refugee songs in the 70s and 1980s. I also met another gentleman named Nhật Nguyen. He's since passed away, but he's wrote some of the most important songs for Vietnamese and Vietnamese Americans, which I'll talk about as well. And I was also able to find online documents from this singer, Pham Duy. He's probably the most prolific songwriter in the history of Vietnam. He's written probably over 400 or 500 songs. And, you know, the American press called him the Woody Guthrie of Vietnam because not only was he a folk singer, but he wrote patriotic songs. He has a song called Vietnam, Vietnam, which is the unofficial anthem of the country. But what I realized, you know, I said my initial question was, why are Vietnamese people so obsessed with the past? Vietnamese being Vietnamese Americans from the former country of South Vietnam. And what I realized was that, you know, in the process of critical thinking, one of the first things you got to ask yourself is, are we even asking the right questions? And I realized that I was asking the wrong question in terms of problematizing Vietnamese people's obsession with the past. And what I learned is that all of us are obsessed with the past. What nation isn't obsessed with the past? And it's not a matter of whether you remember or forget the past. The real question is, which version of the past are you going to remember? Which version of the past are you going to institutionalize, to turn into memorials, museums, and things like that? And one example that made me think of that was a 2015 documentary called Last Days of Vietnam. And it was directed by Rory Kennedy. She's the daughter of Robert F. Kennedy. And this documentary interviews prominent American military and government officials who were involved with essentially rescuing Vietnamese people at the end of the war in 1975. So in April and May of 1975, they essentially disobeyed orders to make sure more people could get out of Vietnam than would have been possible had they simply followed their orders. So people, the interview, I think the most noteworthy one was Richard Armitage, who wound up working in the State Department for the Bush administration. But the point of the story was that this was a way of revisioning the past, because amazingly in the film, you know, this is a feel-good story, it's a redemption story, it's a way of making the United States look good, but conveniently it leaves out much of the context, and the context was that America had lost much of its prestige, much of its honor, the prior 10 years, waging the Vietnam War, and that, you know, America looking so good in this documentary is nice if you forget the fact that of what happened 10 years before. And what this goes to show is that, you know, it's not about remembering or forgetting, that it's that people affirm a traumatic past by rewriting it, right? And this is kind of a philosophical principle that informed my study. And, you know, because it's important to understand, you know, how people deal with the past, that it wasn't just Vietnamese refugees that had to deal with this traumatic past. It was the American public and the American government at large as well. And I'm going to read a short excerpt from the book. Is that, you know, in the context of US history, refugee nationalism has represented not so much a refusal to assimilate into American society, but rather a particular mode of becoming American, becoming refugee American. Forced migration defined most refugee departures, but their experience in America hinged on a particular politics of rescue in both discourse and policy. The fact that an astounding 90% of all refugees admitted to the United States during the Cold War hailed from communist republics left little doubt among refugees and Americans alike how high their particular victimization ranked, thus shaping expectations as to what a guilt-ridden nation still owed them. After all, America's foreign policy failures bore responsibility for risking the lives of war allies. For Vietnamese Americans, the charity they received after arriving and the elevated threat level accorded to communism gave them extra incentive to identify as refugees, whether as a shield against racism or as a strategy to influence foreign policy long after their resettlement. Yet for too long, refugee nationalism has gone misdiagnosed. And what I mean by that is, in becoming refugee American, at least one example of it is that in many sense, in a sense, when they left Vietnam and arrived in the United States, they were already refugees in a cultural sense before becoming refugees in a legal sense. That sometimes we think of assimilation as people leaving a country, and only upon arrival in a country do they begin to learn about the customs, about the culture of their new society. But in the case of refugees, they had a really strong knowledge of what was going on in the United States. And I want to explore that through the test case of music, which in many ways happened almost by accident. And what you see here is the Roosevelt Hotel in Hollywood, California. And how this started was, I interviewed Nam Lok, who's the social worker at Catholic Charities, and he told me about, the first signs of Vietnamese nightlife that started to take shape. And it took shape at this place, the Roosevelt Hotel. And the reason it took place is because a young 30-year-old refugee by the name of Phuong Nguyen came to the United States. He was sponsored by a young Japanese American man, and he got a job at this hotel along with a bunch of other Vietnamese refugees as well. And he was just a busboy, even though he was an acclaimed pianist in Vietnam. His new job was a busboy making $2.10 an hour. One day during work, he saw a piano, he spotted a piano, and during his break, he decided he was gonna stroll over to the piano and just play it for a few minutes because he hadn't seen a piano in a long, long time. And what he didn't realize after playing the piano was that about half an hour had passed. And when he turned around and finished, there was a whole crowd of people behind him and gave him a standing ovation. And then his boss came over, he says, "Can you come to my office and talk?" And he thought, "Oh my God, I'm gonna get fired right now. This is it. I just took too long of a break and I shouldn't have done that." But what happened instead is his boss took him into his office and said, "You're too qualified to be a busboy. I think I got a better job for you. We have this music club in the hotel called the Cinegrill, which you can see in the photo here, and we need a pianist. Can you be our pianist?" And of course he agreed to that. And eventually they asked the manager of the Cinegrill if they could reserve certain nights on the weekend for Vietnamese music. And the manager said, "Yes, we can do that." So for a little bit of time between 1975 and 1976, you could go to Vietnamese nights in Hollywood, California, which kind of became a precursor to the first video music series in the Vietnamese community, which was called Hollywood Nights, which is, been surpassed by another music series called Paris by Night. But this is, the social history behind a lot of the pop culture in the Vietnamese community. And with regards to Nam Lok, what happened with him was he was a 30-year-old musician. He was also in the army in Vietnam. But what happened during the exodus of 1975 was he happened to be in an unfortunate position where he was able to get out of Vietnam, but none of his parents, none of his siblings, his fiance were still in Vietnam. So he was out by himself. He had nothing better to do than to kind of spend time with friends and to spend a lot of time thinking about what he would do with his life. So he was living in Inglewood at the time, and he decided to write a song to really kind of make sense of his experience in the United States, how he felt. And he called this song Farewell Saigon, Saigon Vĩnh Biệt, or Vĩnh Biệt, Saigon. And in late 1975, he had an opportunity to perform this song live at the Cinegrill. And, when he was done singing, he didn't know if he made a good performance or not, but he looked up and he saw everybody in the audience crying. And then what he realized at that time was that, this isn't just my story. This seems to be everyone's story. They seem to be able to relate to it. And a song like Farewell Saigon, was important in terms of being able to facilitate the departure of people from Vietnam who would identify as refugees culturally before they became refugees legally, because they were hearing this song already before they left Vietnam. That this song soon became a hit all over the United States. And soon the Voice of America in Washington, D.C., that had a Vietnamese section, came to Orange County, recorded a song, and they and the BBC broadcast it to Vietnam. So people in Vietnam were learning about this, what was going on outside of Vietnam in this kind of new Vietnamese American community that they didn't quite call Little Saigon yet. It was more the American press that was using that name. But they were learning how refugees were doing and how they were feeling. And let me play for you a short excerpt from that song.
Sài Gòn ơi, tôi xin hứa rằng tôi trở về. Người tình ơi, tôi xin giữ trọn mãi. Dù thời gian có là một thoáng đam mê, phố phường van ánh sao.
Okay. When I interviewed Hemlock about that song, and I asked him about that the line you saw at the top, "Farewell Saigon, I promise I will return." I said, "So why do you contradict yourself in that song?" He said, "Because, you know, even though as a refugee, you don't think you'll ever be able to come back, you still got to hold on to that, whatever hope you have left. Hope is what sustains you." And I think hope is probably what attracted people to the song, even though it is very melancholy in its melody and in its lyrics. Another song that was very popular at that time is called Một chút quà cho quê hương, which is a gift from my homeland in Vietnam, which talks about remittances. It was written by this young songwriter named Viet Dũng, whose father was Vietnam. And this was someone who was resettled in Oklahoma, Nebraska, and eventually moved out west. But, you know, in talking with people throughout the community, which was relatively easy for him to do, being Roman Catholic, so he would be able to see other Vietnamese on Sundays, is, you know, a lot of people seem to share similar experiences when it came to trying to keep in touch with people in Vietnam and sending remittances, which was not the easiest thing to do because legal postal service no longer existed. So you had to send mail through a third party. So maybe through Canadian service or French services would people be able to receive packages to Vietnam. But here's a sample of what's in this song.
Con gửi về cho cha một mảnh áo trắng. Cha mặc một lần khi ra pháp trường với thầy, gửi về Việt Nam nước mắt đong đầy. Mơ ước một ngày quê hương sẽ thanh bình.
And, you know, I had a chance to interview him. He passed away in 2013, but, you know, he talked about performing that song in many places. He said, for example, I performed in San Jose, California to an audience of about 5,000 people. And it seemed like they were just screaming and crying after every single line in that song, which included other things like sending a gold ring, a wedding ring to Vietnam so that they may be able to use it to pay for illegal passage out of the country, or sending candy that's sweet that will be able to kind of relieve people of the bitterness and sorrows of the life there. And I was able to interview Nhật Nguyen, the person I told you who wrote a lot of really popular songs in Vietnam, and including some refugee ones as well. This one here was really, I think, pivotal because he wrote it while still in Vietnam and was able to get it out of the country, even though he was not able to leave himself. He was going to get thrown into a re-education camp. And so he figured, I might not survive the re-education camp. He asked a friend who was going to try to leave the country as a boat person to commit the song to memory. And if they were able to survive that journey, find a way to, you know, get to somebody who could record the song and broadcast it back to Vietnam. And they were able to succeed in that. And his song is called, you know, Anh giải phóng tôi, hay tôi giải phóng anh, which is who liberated whom. And he's making the argument that it was really the South that liberated the North.
Nếu tôi có được phép thần thông, tôi sẽ đưa anh đi thăm Sài Gòn. 5 năm về trước để cho anh thấy rằng anh giải phóng tôi hay tôi giải phóng anh.
This is in reference to certain kind of class politics that most of us were not aware of, which is that a lot of communist propaganda had told Northern soldiers, especially in the Viet Cong, that they were going to liberate the South, that these people in the South were living in squalor, living in dire poverty, and obviously coming into Saigon, that was not what they saw. So that was a part of kind of the inside conversation going on there that was transmitted to the United States, and it was a way of transmitting dissent back to Vietnam, because then if people in Vietnam could listen to the Voice of America or the BBC and hear these songs, they would get a kind of perspective that was not available if they listened to official state radio or state media at that time. No, I don't know how much time I have left, but I'm just going to finish off right here by talking about, one of the main concepts in the book that's really important is the idea of fighting the post-war. If people are seem to be obsessed with the past, it's because the past is pliable. I think not only in terms of that documentary, for example, in terms of rewriting the past, Viet Nguyen, who is at the University of Southern California and won a Pulitzer Prize. I remember seeing him at his talks and saying, it's kind of naive to think that Vietnamese should get over and forget about the Vietnam War, given what's happened in Charlottesville. In 2017, it shows that America is still not over the Civil War, which is over 150 years ago. So the post-war is something that's still being fought. And the US probably thought they had finished fighting the post-war in the 90s by being able to open up diplomatic ties with Vietnam, and Vietnam thinking they had won as well, and that the people in the community in places like Little Saigon, in San Jose, in Orange County, are looking for their own little victory as well. And that from a public opinion standpoint, it's amazing, but also ironic that the former South Vietnamese people have been far more successful fighting the post-war as refugees than they ever were at fighting itself, which is something I've chronicled as best as I could, 6 chapters in this book, and have been able to provide a little bit of a preview for today. So thank you very much for everything.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible talk. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Dr. Chrissy Yee Lau is an assistant professor of history in the Department of Social, Behavioral, and Global Studies at California State University, Monterey Bay. Her research and teaching interests include Asian American history, US women's history, and public history. Her book, Young People, Reshaping Trans-Pacific Japanese America Through the New Woman and Christian Internationalism, explores how college-age Japanese American youth navigated Americanization and racial uplift to create trans-Pacific identities and communities in the 1920s and 1930s. When she's not teaching or researching, she is sewing for the Anti-Sewing Squad, a collective of women craft makers who sew masks for vulnerable communities. And actually, you just announced, Dr. Lau, that you have another book that's coming, but that you're co-editing about the Anti-Sewing Squad from University of California Press. It's coming next year as well. So, which is really incredible, super exciting work. It's my honor to present Dr. Lau.
Hello, Ohlone College. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Dr. Kyle Livy and Dr. Heather McCarty and everyone at the Lytton Center for inviting me to give a talk on my book project and for organizing this event. Let me start to screen share my presentation. So today I will be giving a presentation on the Trans-Pacific New Woman. And this presentation comes out of my forthcoming book manuscript, which Dr. Kyle Livy mentioned, entitled Young People. And it will be published with the University of Washington Press by next spring of 2022. I'd like to follow the tradition of Dr. Phuong Nguyen, my esteemed colleague, and first begin with telling you a little bit about how I became a historian. So how I became a historian has quite a bit to do also with my personal history and my past. Here is a photo of me when I was a young kid, and that is my mother and father. I think this picture was taken in the 1990s, and it has a Polaroid feature of it. So I am the first woman in my family to earn a PhD. I come from a working class Chinese immigrant family. My grandparents fled the communist revolution in China during the 1960s and the 1970s. They migrated to the United States in hopes of achieving the elusive American dream. They had 6 children, including my mother. And out of all of the children, 5 of them did manage to achieve the American dream. My uncles became engineers and lawyers and bought big homes. My aunties married doctors and also bought big homes. It seemed like they really achieved the American dream. The black sheep of the family was my family, my parents. We continued to struggle economically and remain working class. My mother, she took a typing class and she became a typist for the city. She was a typist for the majority of her life until she passed away from cancer when I was 13 years old. My father immigrated over and studied to become a chemist. But he experienced downward mobility and he ended up working various jobs in the low-wage public sector. So as far as I can remember, he had jobs from working in Chinese restaurants to working in a liquor store. I remember from my childhood memories that I always snuck away candy from the liquor store and ate it in the back. My father also actually passed away last Thanksgiving, and his biggest regret was that he never achieved great wealth. So because my family was poor and working class and our history tragic, I was always surrounded by a lot of gossip by my extended family, and they had their interpretations for why my parents failed to achieve the American dream. Certainly some of it was true. Stories of bad investments, gambling, toxic masculinity made a lot of sense. But I think what always bothered me was that none of them seemed to question the pursuit of the American dream itself. So when I went to college, I took my first class in Asian American history. And I was finally able to learn histories that denaturalized the American dream and that highlighted systems of inequalities in class, race, and gender, which made the American dream an exception and not the rule. I was given tools to figure out the past. I reconsidered race and gender not as biological facts, but as categories of historical change. And the best part was that I could formulate my own interpretation of the past based on research and evidence. So being a student of Asian American history was incredibly empowering. And I was able to reclaim my own history and empathize with my parents in a new way. So I remember sitting every day in my first Asian American history class, walking away with one wish every lecture. And that wish was, if I could become a professor of Asian American history, that would be a dream come true. So because my college years were such a formative time for me, that I decided to focus my research on young people and the development of their racial and gender politics in the 1920s. I think too often young people get a bad rap. They are never taken seriously, or they're seen as immature. But I find that not only do young people have to inherit the racialized trauma of the previous generations, but that they have their own ideas and their own agency in creating lasting change. And for me, women especially are the ones that are the ones that are often overlooked, but they are the first to mobilize good trouble. Now, when we think of women and social change, nowhere more rich and plentiful are the new women of the progressive era and the roaring 20s. The new woman was a tidal shift, a tidal change in gender roles. Some of the more popular and common conceptions of the new woman include the suffragettes, who fought for a woman's right to vote and for the passage of the 19th Amendment. Progressive women like Jane Addams that worked in settlement houses in urban immigrant neighborhoods in the South Side of Chicago. And of course, the rebellious flappers that expanded female sexuality. However, US women's history all too often centers the stories of white middle-class women, and they neglect to tell the stories of women of color. Thanks to more recent scholarship, we are beginning to learn more about new women of color, like the new Negro woman and La Mujer Nueva. So my research expands our understanding of the new woman by looking at the trans-Pacific new woman. And in particular, my book focuses on the Japanese American new woman. My book features a chapter on 3 women: Susie Yamamoto, a farmer; Chia Otera, a homemaker; and Lily Sato, a YWCA secretary. Today, for the presentation, I'll share with you Susie Yamamoto's story, the new woman farmer. A trans-Pacific new women like Susie Yamamoto expands our understanding of the new woman in US history in 3 main ways. The first is that while the new woman phenomenon has been studied largely within a domestic or a national context, that is, just within US shores, Susie's story resituates the new woman within a transnational context, that is, within the geopolitical relations between US and Japan. So Susie grew up in the 1910s and 1920s at a time when local and national debates took place over the question of whether Japanese immigrant women should be allowed to migrate to the United States. By the 1920s, the anti-Japanese movement, which was largely made up of white labor unions that saw Japanese labor as an economic threat to their existence, they had already successfully limited Japanese male migrants through the passage of the 1907 and 1908 Gentlemen's Agreement. So by the 1920s, they then redeployed the yellow peril stereotype of Japanese takeover by centering on racialized fears of women as the main conduit of Japanese takeover. So, for instance, they charged that Japanese women improperly worked in the fields, and by doing so, they would bring down the white man's standard of living. In order to protect their white male entitlement to land, fortune, and of course, traditional gender roles, the anti-Japanese movement mobilized a racist chivalry to pass the 1924 Immigration Act. They claimed that they needed to protect white women's place in the home by banning Japanese women's immigration, and therefore no more Japanese women working in the fields. So the debates on Japanese immigration became politically evacuated to the question about gender roles. A question of, was it true? Can it be? Did Japanese immigrant women work in the fields improperly? For women like Susie, whose father owned a restaurant and ran a farm, she did work in the fields, as did many working class immigrant families at the time. All members of the family contributed to family labor. But now her labor and their labor became politically fraught and contentious. The Japanese Associations of America, an organization that saw themselves as the governing body of the Japanese immigrant community, they tried to disarm the arguments of the anti-Japanese movement by telling farmers to refrain from working their women in the fields. That, however, did not go well, and many migrant farming families had to work and continue to put food on the table. Susie, however, understood the value of collegial relations between white and Japanese American communities. She had served as a liaison in many capacities. For instance, she served as an interpreter in the courts. And she valued her friendships with her white peers. She enjoyed going on leisure car trips across the countryside. So Susie really wanted to be accepted and valued. She soon felt embarrassed when she saw Japanese immigrant women working in the fields. And she went one step further. When she moved to Los Angeles to attend the University of Southern California, she decided that she should work in a white home in order to learn proper domesticity, to learn what a woman's place in the home really was. So at a time when white women have won the right to vote, moved into new professions, and expanded sexuality, because of the geopolitical climate, Japanese American women are moving back into the home. The second way that Trans-Pacific New Women expand our understanding of New Women is by looking at the emergence of the New Woman in rural towns. So by the late 1920s, Susie Yamamoto had lived in Los Angeles. She became a member of the Japanese YWCA. She also attended a Japanese church, the Japanese Methodist Episcopal Mission. And after LA, she decided to move back to San Bernardino and take over her family farm. So there, she was quite a brilliant entrepreneur. She developed a free garbage collection service that was mutually beneficial between her and the city. So she utilized her farm, which I think she looks like from the news article, she had about 40,000 hogs. And she hired about 40 immigrant workers, and she directed the workers to pick up everyone's trash in San Bernardino. And at that time, trash was mostly food scraps. So after they picked up the trash, they would feed it to her hogs at the farm. So it was mutually beneficial because the townspeople didn't have to pay for garbage service, and she had an endless food supply for her hogs. So because of her innovation, Susie actually became a poster child for the progressives that wanted to reform rural life, as well as for Japanese colonialists who wanted youth to continue their parents' legacy. So at that time, country life reformers wanted to revive rural life because they saw rural towns as being backwards. So they wanted to revive it by bringing in modern values of new technology, big business, and new gender roles. They featured Susie Yamamoto as their poster child for public relations. And they featured her in newspapers all across rural America, highlighting her new woman values. They highlighted her ability and to speak and learn several languages, which was a sign of being cosmopolitan. They highlighted her business savvy and her technological innovation. So Susie's story was actually reprinted in many newspapers across small town America, from the Newcastle News in Pennsylvania to Winter's Enterprise in Texas. Now, within the Japanese American community, Susie also became part of a very small but privileged minority. She was part of the landed class, meaning that she was one of the few Japanese Americans that owned land. This made her a small minority because by 1920, they had passed the Alien Land Law, which disallowed Japanese immigrants from owning land. So for Japanese colonialists, they had hoped that the landed class, farmers like Susie, would serve as cultural bridges to repair the strained relations between US and Japan after the 1924 Immigration Act. So while the new woman signaled a tidal change in gender roles in the urban area, looking at new women in the rural areas allows us to understand the new women in new ways. They became a symbol of reform used by progressives, and they also became a cultural bridge used by Japanese colonialists to repair trans-Pacific relations. The third way that trans-Pacific new woman expands our understanding of the new woman is by showing just how women experience the limits of the New Deal era and the New Deal programs at the local level. So in 1932, Susie Yamamoto was at the height of her career. She had several ranches of hog farms in San Bernardino, in Long Beach, in Bellflower. She was also married to John Ando, who was a leader of the Japanese American Citizens League. By then, they were going around encouraging Japanese Americans to vote. They would hold forums that would host political candidates. So she was encouraging Japanese Americans to vote. However, when the 1932 foot and mouth disease broke out, her empire started to collapse. This disease largely affected clove-foot animals like hogs, and some of the symptoms were that they would run a high fever, they would have blisters, and they would also have sores. So public health leaders and state officials feared that this would spread quickly and destroy the food supply. So they slaughtered suspect pig farms like Susie's. However, after the slaughter, Susie still had to collect garbage. And without pigs to consume it, she was operating at a loss. She did get some relief from the state, but not enough. And so she asked the city of San Bernardino to either let her out of her contract or provide a subsidy by charging residents for their garbage service. The city stalled, expecting her to endure the loss, but then saw an opportunity to push her out, as well as her 40 immigrant employees, so that they could employ unemployed white men as a result of the Great Depression and move them into the garbage sector. The city took bids and hired a white male farmer named E. Farrington, who ran on the platform. He promised to hire white male citizens first. And moreover, the city, when they hired him, subsidized his contract by charging for garbage service. So essentially, the city gave to him what Susie had asked for. They gave him the relief that Susie had asked for. So while it is largely known among historians that women often received the short end of the stick when it came to New Deal legislation and providing relief during the Great Depression, Susie's case shows us just how little local governance cared about providing relief for women's businesses and immigrant workers. So I'd like to close just by recapping the many ways that Asian American history can provide new directions for US women's history. So in conclusion, stories like Susie Yamamoto's expands our understanding of the new woman by reframing women's lives and experiences within a transnational context, exploring understudied areas like the emergence of new women in rural towns, as well as examining a local approach to providing relief for women-owned businesses during the New Deal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lau, for another excellent talk. We're really excited now to shift gears and open the floor to questions and comments. So as noted in the chat window, you can see there are two different ways that you can submit questions to our two esteemed panelists. One is using the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen if you're joining us by Zoom, or you can send an email to lyttoncenter@ohlone.edu if you're joining us here or via Facebook Live, where we've been broadcasting on our Lytton Center page. And we have a big group of attendees. And we have some really great questions that have already come in. So Dr. McCarty and I will start asking a few questions, and I'm going to pass the reins over to Dr. McCarty.
All right, great. So the first question is actually for both of you, and one of our student participants would like to ask you all, can you share with us your experiences of being a historian as an Asian American? I've always wanted to become a history major, but people always consider history to be useless, unproductive, and irrelevant. How do you overcome the stigma and these preconceptions? What are the challenges of becoming a historian as an Asian American / Vietnamese American?
Chrissy, you want to go first?
Sure. My mic is still on. Okay, can you share with us your experiences of being a historian? Sure. I did get my degree in a history program. And I did experience some negativity in that some folks did not think that Asian American history was legitimate. In many ways, that is some of the same sentiment that people feel about ethnic studies. is it really giving people an education? What is it really doing, right? And so a lot of my time in graduate school was trying to overcome feeling that what I'm studying is not important. And so the ways in which I've tried to work through this is to show the ways in which Asian American history is important and actually how it illuminates US history in new ways that we have never seen before. So for instance, in my presentation, I continually talk about how the Trans-Pacific New Woman can tell us new things and illuminate new sites of study and research for what we typically think of the New Woman and in US women's history. So that was just one of my experiences going through history and my ways to overcome it. But I would also say that since I was in the history program, I also found a lot of support and mentorship in interdisciplinary programs like Asian American Studies and Women and Gender Studies. And so I would encourage you to start there. If you're feeling overwhelmed or if you're feeling alone, look to mentors, look to professors who will encourage your study and who will encourage your research and who will see what you do as legitimate.
I think for me, I could go through this long story of how I became a historian, who I talked to, but I think for each and every one of you, I think who are interested in history, I think what's important is really learning a good writer, learning to tell based on the evidence that you're able to find. And this book that I wrote, which is based on my doctoral dissertation, is something that I really took great pains to make as accessible and clear as possible in my writing, so that as many people who didn't have PhDs, college students, people who didn't attend college, but most importantly, people in my own family would be able to read this and appreciate what I had done to try to put the pieces together for a piece of history that most people in my family are extremely unwilling to talk about. I asked Lytton Nguyen, who I told you earlier won the Pulitzer for writing the novel The Sympathizer, how he accounts for the in his writing about culture and identity, because there are so many people who don't want to talk about the past. So how does he account for those in his writing and in his talks? And he didn't have quite an answer yet, but the story he gave was just as important, which was that, you know, there are some people who like to talk more than others, and he doesn't understand why. His own father, for example, who was an officer in the Vietnamese army, never talks about the past. So he uses his father-in-law instead as a kind of gateway into these conversations. His father-in-law will talk endlessly, nonstop about these things. When I finally got this book published, my father-in-law was so excited about it, he bought like 20 copies so he and all his friends could read it. But you know, his English is limited, so he said he understood maybe 10% of what I wrote in there, even though I tried as much as possible to leave out all the jargon and the high theoretical language in my prose. I tried to write in what they call narrative history style, where you're really developing, you're almost like writing a novel where you develop these people and talk about how they look, how they feel, and they almost feel like characters in a novel instead of historical figures or just regular people. I had a friend who was a PhD. He was from Vietnam. He was a foreign student, but he got a PhD in physics at Cornell University. So he was very highly educated. His English was pretty darn good. And he only understood about 25% of the book. But nevertheless, that didn't discourage me. It just made me feel like, you know, it was worth it, because if I had tried to appeal to an academic audience, my father-in-law probably would have understood only 1% of it instead of that 10%. That friend in physics would have only understood 10% instead of 25%. And learning to be a good writer is so important. And through the process in grad school of sharing my drafts with other people, these reading and writing groups, and people telling me that they were crying while they were reading it, like really meaningful, which meant I knew I was doing a good job. And of course, if you want to be a good writer, you got to be a good reader first. You got to read a lot of stuff and find your voice.
Fantastic. Wow, those are great responses, and so helpful because there are so many different career paths that you can take with a history major and in working in other disciplines and fields where you study history, like ethnic studies. But hearing about that path of becoming a historian for both of you as Asian Americans is really fantastic. I want to move on to another question, and this question comes from one of the attendees. And goes to both of you as well. Could you speak to the intergenerational relationships in the communities you have studied? How did the relationships between older and younger folks shape the histories you investigated? And either of you can start.
I think for me, I think it was really difficult at first because it seemed that the issue was always framed as one of the old guard or people who had barely lived in the United States, who grew up in Vietnam versus people who lived here more. And that the assumption that, you know, the Vietnamese American story was an assimilation story, that we were just waiting for this older generation who were very intolerant, who were anti-communist, very anti-free speech, would eventually just die off and things would get better and everybody would live happily ever after. I think didn't quite turn out that way. It's a little bit more complicated than that, mainly because these folks are not obsessed just about stuff that happened 40 years ago. They're obsessed with what's going on today in Vietnam. So that, you know, that protest that was happening in 1999 in Orange County wasn't just about free speech in the United States. It was about making a statement internationally that folks in the United States were not going to put up with, you know, I guess an information or disinformation, whatever you want to call it, a psychological warfare campaign that they alleged that Vietnam was trying to pull in 1999 using the owner of that video store as, you know, their kind of front man in that. So for the Vietnamese community, and you know, only being able to talk to people, was I able to kind of grasp that. That I finally kind of not necessarily agree, but at least understand. And I think that for me was really important. That I thought that, you know, and I think this happens to a lot of scholarship in the Vietnamese American community, or even prior to studies that were being done by myself or Viet Nguyen or Thi Bui, is that I think people assume that they didn't. That's kind of really sad and tragic, that people were essentially using stereotypes or kind of theories they were comfortable with to draw conclusions prematurely. And I think I made that mistake myself, thinking that, you know, the anti-communism, the presumed hostility to the First Amendment was a form of false consciousness. That if Vietnamese Americans who felt this way, this old guard, this anti-communist faction, simply just educated themselves more, spent more time in the United States and became more American, that they would start to understand what young people were going through. And what seemed to be going on was that what I learned was that neither side was really talking to each other. They were talking past each other. And that after talking to the different people, I didn't necessarily say I agree with their positions, but I understood where they were coming from. And it surprised me because I think most of us would be able to do that if we just simply talk to people more instead of making these assumptions. And one of these assumptions that seemed to persist for such a long time was that, for example, that the partition of Vietnam from one side being communist to one side being non-communist happened in 1954, North being communist, South being anti-communist. There was an initial migration of 1 million people from North to South as part of that partition. And it's generalized that about out of those 1 million people, the majority were Roman Catholics, and that they had a disproportional amount of power and representation in the new government in South Vietnam. And as a result of being in these high class positions of power and prestige and social class, that they were overrepresented among that first wave of refugees that left Vietnam in 1975, and therefore using this kind of, I don't want to say Marxist, but kind of like crude class analysis, that that's all we need to know about them, and we don't need to dig any deeper into who this community is, what they are, that they represented the elite of Vietnam. They did not represent the best interests of the nation at large, and therefore their experiences are not important to us, kind of thing, that they were dismissed out of hand as a result of that kind of very crude class analysis. And I think, while there are some individuals who are worthy of that crude class analysis, which I discovered in my research, that the majority of people are not so easy to generalize about. Chrissy, what's your take?
Thank you for that question. So in my research on Japanese American young people in the 1920s, they are completely haunted by the previous generation. So in Japanese American history, we tend to identify time periods according to generation. So the first generation, which they call the Issei, oftentimes they are the Japanese immigrants that migrate to the US from the late 1880s, and then all the way up to the 1940s in internment period. And then after World War II and internment, historians then begin to focus on the Nisei generation, or what they would call second generation youth, which would include American-born Japanese, as well as the Kibe, which were American-born Japanese peoples, but went back to Japan to get their education and then came back to the US. So my work resituating young people in the 1920s actually says, well, there were young people also in the early period that is predominated by the Issei. But this overall framework that historians have used to discuss Japanese American history is also haunting of in the primary sources themselves, because young people are constantly trying to get out of their parents' shadow. And their parents have ideas about how they should grow up, what kind of culture they should have, what food they should eat, what religion they should have. And it's really tied to their own politics. But the young people that I study, they're trying to navigate their parents' politics and their parents' history, but also find a voice for themselves, and also navigate their new communities with their predominantly white American friends. So what I find is that the youth try to walk this fine balance of their parents' politics and in negotiating their own. So they, in many ways, change the Japanese immigrant community and reshape it in their own image. They change the ethnic church, which is predominantly for Japanese immigrants and only spoke in the Japanese language. They change it and they form youth groups. And there, they're able to ask their own questions about the Bible. They form new youth-based programs. And they create a whole sports league that involves basketball, volleyball, baseball for youth. And many of them also begin to form their own new organizations. So while the immigrant organizations had the Japanese Associations of America and really worked to prevent the land law, to prevent the Immigration Act, the youth had organizations like the Japanese American Citizens League that they began organizing in the 1920s. They also organized YWCA troops, YMCA troops, and their own clubs. And those were the spaces that they found were a safe haven to develop their own politics, to not always be under the specter of their parents' eyes. And of course, they also created their own leisure, like dances, because they also had their own ideas of how to date and how to marry. So So there was quite a bit of politics between the generations. And I find that young people were really trying to navigate both of them and create their own sense of community and their own ideas of what they saw would be more equitable race relations.
Wow, super interesting. Thank you both for sharing your insights about intergenerational relationships and with regards to your own research. That was really super fascinating. Thank you. This next question is for Dr. Nguyen. Is it possible for Vietnamese Americans to talk about the Vietnam War without being viewed as anti-American or anti-America?
I don't know exactly what that means. I mean, in the mainstream of the United States, I think it's pretty much a consensus that the Vietnam War, at least as far as the US government was concerned, was a foreign policy mistake. I think what's most troubling is, I think, the conversation about Vietnam in the mainstream at large. I don't know if Vietnamese have any trouble talking about it per se, unless I think what's harder to talk about is the state of Vietnam today and what role the United States should have in foreign policy with Vietnam. And I remember reading an article a few years back talking about the pro-democracy movement in Vietnam. And the pro-democracy movement in Vietnam is only going to be able to make so much progress. And it's really dependent on the American left being able to join in that argument. For right now, the main factions in the United States that are part of that, or that support the pro-democracy movement in Vietnam, are one, the business community, and two, the kind of Christian community. And those tend to be kind of on the right wing. And the left is sitting it out for obvious reasons, because the left is populated with people who were of that age during the war. And unfortunately, we can't have a really honest conversation about it as long as that generation is still alive, because it'll still bring up the old wounds from the 60s and 70s, where if people on the left say, maybe we need to reform over there, that communism isn't doing as good of a job as it promised, then the right will just kind of jump on them and say, well, see, we were right to fight that war in the first place. They'll be fighting the old battles of the 60s and 70s instead of having an honest and good faith conversation today. And that's kind of really unfortunate, because I think that generation is still fighting those squabbles. So I don't think it's any less dangerous for Vietnamese to talk about the war than it is for Americans to do it. But thank you for the question anyways. But I do want to point out that, being viewed as anti-American is kind of a danger for anybody who wants to protest the status quo. That, if you're fighting the status quo, the kind of knee-jerk reaction from conservatives in this country, regardless of the issue, is to simply say you're anti-American and to try to do something about it. In 1968, when John Carlos and can't remember the other sprinter raised their fists up in Mexico City, Brent Musburger, who is now the radio voice of the Las Vegas Raiders, he was a young sports writer at that time, didn't know didn't know how to make sense of the Black Power fist in the air, and he referred to it as a Nazi-like salute, and referred to these two men as stormtroopers, as in Nazis. So already they were, from the start, they were depicted as anti-American. So I don't think the Vietnam War issue is any more dangerous than any other issue to talk about.
Thank you for that. And given the political bend of some of the questions, we're getting lots of questions today, which is fantastic. I want to note an accessory that both of our speakers are wearing today. It's an I voted sticker, and I want to encourage folks to make sure that they vote. You might be aware that we have a big election coming up. Oh, look, there it is. We have a big election coming up. You probably have been aware of that. And kind of a historic night last night with the vice presidential debate. It is the first time that we had, there's been lots of talk about this, is the first time we've had an African-American woman on a major party ticket, but it's also the first time we've had an Asian American woman on a major party ticket. So it's, really a really timely moment for us to have this panel and to be thinking forward. And I also want to thank everyone that's come. We still have more time for questions. We have over 100 folks who've come to the talk. It was a great turnout. So I want to shift gears. I have a question for Dr. Lau. Hello, Dr. Lau. This is a question about something that you brought up in your talk about rural people and places as being seen as backwards, and that Yamamoto was actually used, and you noted was sort of used as all across the United States in newspaper articles as sort of counter to this. Were there any racial connotations that were evoked by the use of Yamamoto, and did it create any tensions with white rural folks, either in or around her community or beyond?
Thank you for that question. So in the feature vignette of Susie Yamamoto's stories in various local newspapers, they always made sure to highlight her ethnicity, that she was an American-born from Japanese parents. And at that time, they made sure to highlight her race because that was part of the progressive agenda. Progressives saw themselves as advancing a multicultural nation. So at the time in the 1920s, not unlike today, the US was very divided. There were one group, the KKK, that believed that the US should be strictly white, and they advocated a white supremacist agenda. But on the other hand, in the 1920s, they had a lot of debates with another group who really saw the US as a culturally pluralist nation. So under that group was the progressives. And so the progressives largely, they were in the cities, they saw themselves as metropolitan, cosmopolitan, and so they wanted to reform rural towns, why they saw rural towns as being backwards, small, and uncity-like, right? So the progressives who wanted to reform country life utilized Yamamoto's ethnicity to bring in some diversity, to bring in change, to bring in big business to their overall agenda of reforming rural life. Now, her piece was printed in at least a dozen newspapers across rural America. And the question of what was the response of rural America is something that I'm still pondering. We know from other historians, rural historians, like Dr. Kyle Livy, who is going to come out with a manuscript on rural California in the next couple of years. We know that many rural historians have found that actually the response to country life progressives was really, they didn't appreciate progressives trying to reform rural life. And many of them remained traditionalists, and many of them did not take well to this public relations of trying to bring in new women and gender roles. And so that's partially why we see the anti-Japanese movement succeeding and passing the 1924 Immigration Act. They actually align with white supremacy in some ways, and then also they don't want to change their way of living. They felt like modern progressives were upending things for them. I think we can see a little bit of this sentiment when we move along with Susie's life and see her in the 1930s when basically city folks didn't want to help her and give her relief when her pig farm was devastated. And they wanted to prioritize the employment of white workers first in front of before immigrant workers.
Thank you, Dr. Lau.
Great, thank you so much for that. So we just have time for one more question, and this last question came in through the Lytton Center email, and it's for both of you. The theme of pliability or history is pliable has come up today. So much of American history is being or has been erased, especially when it comes to dehumanization. What is the best way to help others connect the dots of history to have a better understanding of the things that can't be proven on paper, but are nonetheless true?
I can start us off. So I think that Dr. Nguyen's book is a really great example. And what he does with history is he finds and does and conducts oral histories. And oral histories are the tool of the people. Oral histories are a way to capture histories that are not documented in archives, that people think are not important, but we have living people that we can get their memories and we can write it down. So oral histories have always been a history of the people and of women in particular to get their perspectives and to reclaim their histories. So I would encourage oral history. I do oral histories in my classes. We're gonna do an oral history with the Anti-Sewing Squad and put it up as a digital archive. And so another thing is accessibility. Make documents that are in archives, make oral histories that you do accessible to the general public. And so that, so public history for me is really important to making history more accessible, making marginalized histories more accessible. So I have a special place in my heart for public history because I've worked in museums, because I believe in history of the public good, like what the Lytton Center is doing, making it accessible, freely available to people beyond academia, right? But to the everyday general people.
Yeah, I think it's really important to really get these stories out, because I mean, there's kind of a relationship between, you know, history, memory, and myth in the way we kind of really think about the past, right? Our first primary source is memory and our connection to the past. Either we live this history ourselves, or we talk to people who've lived in the past, you know. And in terms of kind of mainstream history, one of the things that is being talked about among people is like, who was worse as a president, George Bush or Donald Trump? Is not that bad, because he's obviously benefiting from Trump's incompetence and corruption right now. People are saying, well, whoa, and the media is calling all these people moderates. They're far from moderates. For anybody who remembers what it was like living during that time, you know, Trump hasn't tanked the economy just yet. He's about to, but you know, Bush did that and then some. But after memory is, you know, is history. That when these people who are kind of these reservoirs of the past, these custodians of past through their own lived experience, no longer with us, we hope that historians are around to be able to share the past. And historians can only do that competently if they have been able to access records, they've been able to talk to these people like Chrissy has mentioned, through oral history, through other channels, to tell them that their stories are important, to get them to share them, no matter how ashamed they might be about their lives. Because oftentimes when we do ethnic history, you know, we talk about a lot of the unfortunate things that have happened in people's lives. And oftentimes people don't want to share those things. They will go to their grave with those stories, because we live in a society, and probably we're not the only one, where misfortune is the victim's own fault, that it has nothing to do with society being the problem. That if you didn't do well, you must have, you know, not worked hard enough, and there's something wrong with you, not with society. And that we are trying to undo that misconception. And unfortunately, if historians don't do the work and those people that lived there passed away, all we have left is myth. And for people who've studied Asian Americans, myth seems to be still plays a dominant role in how we understand what happened in the past with Asian Americans. So, you know, one of the myths that dominates is that Asians are perpetually foreign. They never want to become American, because Asia and America, East and West, are diametrically opposed to one another in these kinds of stereotypes. So a lot of people let these stereotypes do the thinking for them. So if people ask certain questions like, you know, why was a Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882 and all these other racist laws and policies enacted? If people don't have access to good history, or people to tell these stories about what happened, then these myths take over and do all the explaining for us. And people will answer questions by blaming the victim and say, well, they must have not wanted to become Americans, so they got what they deserve. And it leads to this kind of problematic assumption amongst this younger generation that thinks that, you know what, you know, being assimilated or being Americanized started with them, not thinking that earlier generations were just as confident and assured about their place in society, but they were still discriminated against. And I still see students of mine when they watch oral histories of people who lived in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they speak really, really good English. They know how to dance really well. They're very versed in American culture. And they're like, oh, that's not like my parents. But that's the point. There were Asians here before your own family, and they dealt with these struggles as well. And it's good for you to know that, you know, your strategies of trying to deal with discrimination in the society are nothing new, that there's prior generations that have done this as well. And we can learn from their experiences.
Thank you so much. I want to, on behalf of the Lytton Center and Ohlone College, thank both of you for giving truly exceptional talks and sharing about your experience. I think that was one of the most impactful things for me, certainly, to hear, and I hope for our students as well, because we have so many different opportunities to tell different kinds of stories. And actually, that was something that was coming up a lot in the questions that people were putting forward, is how to tell their stories. And I think this has been really inspirational to go out and do that and really create new history, to go make history as we teach our students here at Ohlone College. I want to plug our next major event. You should see the flyer up on your screen now. It is Why History Matters, How Slavery Helped Develop American Gynecology. It's a talk by Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens, who is a professor of the history of medicine at the University of Nebraska and the author of Medical Bondage. You actually may have seen Dr. Cooper Owens before. She was just on ABC News. Her book, actually, her recent book, inspired an episode of Lovecraft Country. If you're watching that, it's kind of cool. She's a really fantastic speaker. We'll be welcoming her on November 2nd at 2 p.m. And there's a link in the chat, and all this information is available for you in the chat, so you can join us at our next event. I really want to share my appreciation to everyone that was able to join us today. If you haven't already, definitely check us out. You can like us on Facebook and follow us there, where we send lots of updates and lots of great information about the great work that's happening here at Ohlone College. I really appreciate all of you joining us, and we're done. Thank you so much to both of our speakers. Excellent. Thank you. And we are going to close out.